I'd like to welcome everyone to the University of Tulsa and the University of Tulsa College of Law this evening. It's hard to believe, looking in this crowd, that I was worried at all about whether we would fill this room. Now I'm worried that we need to get more seats in the back of the room. So thank you very much to all of those in the community for coming out tonight to our John W. Hager lecture. Just a moment about this lecture and who John Hager was. John Hager was a torts professor, and I did not have the privilege of knowing him, but all of those who did have the privilege of knowing John Hager describes him as just extremely warm, extremely brilliant, and an absolutely excellent teacher. And upon his untimely death, his students, his colleagues, and friends donated quite generously to make this Hager lecture series possible. Although he was a torts professor, I understand he was most interested in issues related to ethics and justice. And I know that he would be smiling at this event tonight because we are throwing issues of justice on the table in a very poignant way this evening. So many of us in this room have moments during the course of our day or weeks or years where we stop in our tracks and say to ourselves, we just can't believe how far this country has come in terms of race and race relations. Now, for some of us, that moment may have been the inauguration of Barack Obama, or maybe it was his acceptance speech the night that he won the election in 2007. I actually had another moment just this past week. My husband, Ken, who's right up front there, did what he does often, in that I might be upstairs with the kids and he yells at me, you gotta come down. You gotta see this. There's something on TV. You gotta see this. And normally I ignore him, but this time I didn't. I actually went downstairs, and the Rachel Maddow show was on, and she did a very moving piece on Representative John Lewis and the Freedom Riders. And she talked and showed lots of photos and footage from the Freedom Rides from DC to Montgomery. And she pointed out that at every stop, the riders were attacked, firebombed, beaten, or in prison. And when they finally arrived at the end of their ride in Montgomery, after having been treated this way at every stop along the way, the police and the police force just decided to stay home. They didn't come, and of course what happened? The Freedom Riders were beaten, and there were pictures of Representative Lewis with blood on his face. Now, the reason she was doing this story is because this Sunday, the chief of police in Montgomery, his name was Kevin Murphy, he publicly apologized at a church service to Representative Lewis for the police department's inaction 50 years ago. And he presented Representative Lewis with his badge, and he gave him a big hug. Now, Rachel Maddow kept on emphasizing that this was truly an amazing story, and I think the point of the story was sort of one of these moments. We have come so far as a country, and we have come so far in terms of race. And our speaker tonight really provocatively challenges this narrative. And she asks us to consider, have we really come so far? Or how have we come so far? Or have we merely replaced the de jure segregation of Jim Crow, the very segregation that the Freedom Riders were attempting to break, with a new type of Jim Crow, a new type of laws, and new types of practices? So it is my my distinct honor to welcome Michelle Alexander, a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, legal scholar, Supreme Court clerk, and now award-winning author, to speak to us about the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be here, to be surrounded by so many people willing to engage in meaningful dialogue about the system of mass incarceration that has emerged in the United States, a system that has decimated so many of our communities, destroyed so many families, and literally turned back the clock on racial progress in the United States. And it seems fitting, I think, that we would be having the conversation here in Oklahoma, a state that has in many ways been leading the race to incarcerate. According to the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, that is the truth. According to the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, the state is fourth in this country in its male rate of incarceration, and first when it comes to female incarceration rates. And to be first in this nation in terms of rates of incarceration is to be first in the world. It's to have the highest rate of incarceration on the planet for women, and to be fourth when it comes to men. So here in Tulsa, with its complicated story of racial struggle and racial triumph, I think that it's fitting for us to consider what does mass incarceration mean for us here in this community and the nation as a whole. And as was just alluded to, we live in confusing times. You turn on the television set and there's President Barack Obama looking handsome, dignified, and in charge, standing in the Rose Garden holding court with reporters as the President of the United States. And then you flip the channel and there's Michelle Obama digging a garden in the backyard of the White House, not as a servant or a maid or as a slave, but as the First Lady, schooling America on better health and how to be good stewards of our planet. And then you flip the channel again and there's the whole Obama family descending the stairs of Air Force One, waving to the crowd, cheered by America and around the world. But then you drive a few blocks from the White House and you find the other America. And you wonder, whoa, what wrong turn did I make? How did I miss that promised land? Though it looked so good from a distance, looked so good on TV. Now, I was raised to believe in great racial progress, and I had a lot of reason to believe in it. My parents were interracially married, and I was born in 1967, the year Loving versus Virginia was decided, the U.S. Supreme Court case that struck down anti-miscegenation laws as unconstitutional. And in my growing up, I was constantly told about the great progress that was being made, and I was raised to believe in the ideal of colorblindness and this idea that we are on kind of a great march, linear march towards greater and greater degrees of freedom. And so in many ways, I think both my parents as well as myself were lulled to sleep as changes began to occur in our society all around us, changes that did not fit neatly with the ideal of great racial progress and the ideal of colorblindness that I know my parents desperately wanted to believe in. And were raising me to believe in as well. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once said there is, quote, Nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, end quote. And he was talking at that time about a profound moral revolution that was underway. It was a struggle for the dignity and humanity of all humankind, a struggle to end what was then America's latest caste system, known as Jim Crow. And just shortly before his death, he told an audience the story of Rip Van Winkle, who famously fell asleep for 20 years. And he told the audience, that when Rip fell asleep, there was a sign posted on the wall of a nearby inn that had a picture of King George III of England emblazoned on it. But when Rip woke up 2 decades later, that same sign had a picture of George Washington on it. And Dr. King told the audience that the most striking fact about Rip Van Winkle was not that he had slept through for 20 years, but that he had slept through a revolution. He said, quote, "There are all too many people who, in some great period of social change, fail to achieve the new mental outlooks that the new situation demands." I think his words are as relevant today as they were back then. Many of us, myself included, virtually slept through a revolution, actually a counter-revolution. A counter-revolution that has blown back so much of the progress that Dr. King and Ella Baker and so many other advocates risked their lives for, and some even died for. This counter-revolution has occurred with barely a whimper of protest, even as millions of people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, have been rounded up, locked up, and then stripped of the very civil and human rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. While many of us have been asleep, a vast new system of racial and social control has emerged that would certainly have Dr. King turning in his grave today. I think one day we may look back and wonder, how could we have possibly slept for so long? Well, I've been asked to share with you the thesis of my book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, and to a large extent, the title of the book does speak for itself. I argue that today, in the so-called era of colorblindness, and even in the age of Obama, that something akin to a caste system is alive and well in America. The mass incarceration of poor people of color in the United States is tantamount to a new caste system, one that shuttles poor kids of color from decrepit, underfunded schools to brand new high-tech prisons. It's a system that locks poor people, overwhelmingly poor folks of color, into a permanent second-class status nearly as effectively as earlier systems of racial and social control once did. It is, in my view, the moral equivalent of Jim Crow. Now, I emphasize in my book, and every time I talk about this, that there was a time when I rejected this kind of talk out of hand. There was a time when I rejected comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery, or mass incarceration and Jim Crow, believing that those kinds of claims and comparisons were just exaggerations, distortions. In fact, I thought that people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing us some harm. We're actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. But after years of working as a civil rights lawyer and advocate representing victims of racial profiling and police brutality and investigating patterns of drug law enforcement in poor communities of color, and attempting to assist people who have been released from prison face one legal barrier after another to finding employment, housing, getting access to education, basic public benefits, even food. People who are finding it nearly impossible to re-enter into a society that had never shown much use for them in the first place. And I had a series of experiences that began what I call my awakening. I began to awaken to the reality that our criminal justice system now functions more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. As I describe in the introduction to the book, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, and exclusion from jury service, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Like I said, I reached this conclusion reluctantly. I was an idealistic young lawyer determined to make good on the promises of Brown versus Board of Education. I believed that my job as a civil rights lawyer was simply to finish the work that had begun and been set in motion through earlier Supreme Court cases and civil rights victories that were now opening the doors of opportunity. But I had a series of experiences that truly began to open my eyes, challenge my own way of thinking and viewing the world. And one in particular, I'll never forget, it involved a young African-American man. He was about 19 years old, who walked into my office one day and forever changed the way that I viewed not only our criminal justice system, but how I viewed myself as a civil rights lawyer and advocate. At the time, I was the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU in California. We had just launched a major campaign against racial profiling by the police. We called it the DWB campaign, or the Driving While Black or Brown campaign. And we had already sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling in their drug interdiction program, but we were looking to sue some other police departments in California as well, departments about which we had received complaints of discriminatory practices and tactics. And so we set up a hotline number for people to call if they believed they'd been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And we put this hotline number up on billboards in Oakland and San Jose and various cities around California, urging people to call the hotline number if they believed they'd been stopped or targeted by the police on the basis of race. And in fact, within the first few minutes that we announced our hotline number on the evening news, we received thousands of calls. Our system crashed temporarily. We had to expand our capacity to deal with the volume of calls we were receiving. And so I was spending my day interviewing one young black or brown man after another who had been stopped, searched, sometimes brutalized by the police for no apparent reason other than race. We were looking for the perfect plaintiff, person who could be the lead plaintiff, the named plaintiff in suit we were planning to file against the Oakland Police Department. So I was interviewing one young man after another, and it was late in the afternoon, and I was getting a little tired. And in walks this young man with a stack of papers about this thick. He had taken detailed notes of his encounters with the police in Oakland over about a 9-month period of time. He had notes regarding every stop, every frisk, every search, every time his car had been pulled over. He had descriptions of every incident. He had names of witnesses who could corroborate what had happened and who said what and what went down on the side of the road. In some cases, he had names of officers and even badge numbers just an unbelievable amount of documentation, detail about this pattern of stops and searches he had experienced in his neighborhood. And the stories he was telling about what the police were doing in his neighborhood were corroborated by other stories we had heard coming out of his area. And so I started to think, maybe he's the one. Maybe he's the dream plaintiff we've been looking for. And so I started asking him more questions, and I'm checking him out, and I'm realizing he is a good-looking young man. You know, he's well-spoken, he's charismatic. I started thinking he'll do great with the media, the juries will love him. I started thinking he's the one. He's the one who could be the lead plaintiff in the case we've been planning to file. And then he says something that makes me pause. And I said, whoa, what did you just say? Did you just say you're a felon? Did you just say you're a drug felon? We'd been screening people who had criminal records. In fact, when people call our hotline number, we would send a form to them to fill out, asking them a bunch of questions about their experiences with the police. And one of them was, have you ever been convicted of a felony? We believed we couldn't represent someone who had been convicted of a felony as a named plaintiff in a racial profiling suit, because we knew that if we did, law enforcement and the media would just be all over us saying, well, of course the police should be keeping their eye on him. He's a criminal. He's a felon, doing their job. And we knew that we wouldn't be able to put someone on the stand who had a felony record as our lead plaintiff without exposing them to cross-examination for an hour in front of the jury about their prior criminal history, thus shifting the jury's attention away from the police conduct and turning it into trial about young man's past criminal history. And so we had been screening people with prior criminal records, and he had not acknowledged his felony record on the form. And so I'm looking at him saying, well, what is this? Are you a drug felon? And he gets quiet for a while, and he's just staring down at the table, and then finally he looks up and he looks me right in the eye and he says, yeah, you know, I am a drug felon, but let me tell you what happened. Let me tell you what happened. The police planted drugs on me, and they set up me and my friend. He starts telling me this big story about how he'd been framed by the police, and then the police beat him and his friend up, and I was just like, I am sorry. I am sorry. I am not going to be able to represent you if you have a felony record. And I try to explain why that's the case, and I'm sorry, and I understand it could feel unfair, and we are going to go after the police department, but you can't be the lead plaintiff with your felony record. He starts trying to give me more information. Now he's trying to give me the names of those officers and their badge numbers and all of this, and I am like, I am sorry. I cannot represent you. And he just keeps getting more and more agitated, giving me more information. He's like, look, I'm telling you, I'm innocent. I just took the plea. I just took the plea because they told me if I didn't plea out, if I didn't take the plea, that I'd be looking at 10 years or more. They told me if I just took the plea that I could just walk out. All I would get was just felony probation. I could just walk out of there. You know, but I'm innocent. I'm telling you, I didn't do it. I was just scared of doing the time. I just took the plea. Like, well, I'm sorry. You took the plea, and now you have a felony record, and I can't represent you. I'm sorry. And then he becomes enraged. And he says to me, you're no better than the police. You're no better than the police. The minute I tell you I'm a felon, you just stop listening. You can't even hear what I have to say. He says, what's to become of me? He says, I can't get a job anywhere because of my felony record. Not anywhere. So where am I supposed to sleep? He said, do you know I can't even get into public housing because of my felony record? He says, I have to sleep in my grandma's basement at night because nowhere else will take me in. So how am I supposed to feed myself? How am I supposed to take care of myself as a man? He says, I can't even get food stamps because of my drug felony. He says, what's to become of me? He says, good luck finding one young black man in my neighborhood they haven't gotten to yet. They've gotten to us all already. And with that, he snatches all those papers up, all of those notes, and just starts ripping them up into tiny little pieces, just throwing them in the air. And he walks out yelling at me, You're no better than the police. Can't believe I trusted you. Well, several months after that, I was doing a public access television show that was broadcasting live out of his neighborhood. I was doing public access TV because we were trying to organize several thousand people to attend a major demonstration at the state capitol protesting the governor's refusal to sign racial profiling legislation. And so we had been holding town hall meetings up and down the state, and the demonstration was coming up in a couple of days, and so I was doing live public access TV, broadcasting live from his neighborhood, trying to tell folks to get on the bus and go to the demonstration in a couple of days. And as soon as that show goes off the air, he comes bursting into the studio, carrying a dirty potted plant. And he's emotional, practically on the verge of tears, and he comes rushing up to me with this plant. And he says, "I'm just here to tell you I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I should have spoken to you that way. I should have treated you like that. I've been seeing you on the news. I've been seeing you out there trying to fight for our people, trying to do the right thing. I should have treated you like that. He said, I would have bought you some flowers, but I still don't have any money. I snatched this plant off my grandma's front porch." And he just thrusts it into my arms. And then he turns around and takes off. He goes running out of the building. I go chasing after him. He jumps into this broke-down car and disappears. Well, several months after that, I'm in my office, open up the newspaper. What's on the front page? Well, the Oakland Writers police scandal is broken. Turns out that a gang of police officers, otherwise known as a drug task force, had been planning drugs on suspects, beating folks up, and who's identified as one of the main officers accused of planning drugs on suspects and beating folks up? The officer he had identified to me as having planted drugs on him and beat up he and his friend. And it was really only then that finally, the light bulb started to come on for me. And I thought to myself, he's right about me. I am no better than the police. The minute he told me he was a felon, I just stopped listening. I couldn't even hear what he had to say. And that was the beginning of my journey of asking myself and others a lot of hard questions, doing an enormous amount of research, and listening more carefully to the stories of those cycling in and out of the prison system. And what I learned in that process was that my great crime wasn't in refusing to represent an innocent man. My great crime was in imagining that there was some path to racial justice that did not include all those we view as guilty. And I also learned some facts that blew my mind. I learned there were more African American adults under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. I learned that as of 2004, more black men were disenfranchised than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting laws that explicitly deny the right to vote on the basis of race. Now, of course, during the Jim Crow era, poll taxes and literacy tests operated to keep black folks from the polls. Well, today, felon disenfranchisement laws in many states now accomplish what poll taxes and literacy tests ultimately could not. A black child born today has less of a chance of being raised by both parents than a black child born during slavery. And this is due in large part to the mass incarceration of black men. There was an article published about this a while back in The Economist magazine, of all places, entitled How the Mass Incarceration of Black Men Harms Black Women. And in it, the article explained that the majority of black women in the United States, including about 70% of professional black women, are unmarried, and that this is due largely to the mass incarceration of black men, which takes them out of the dating pool. At the years they would be most likely to commit to a partner or to a family. But what's worse is that by branding them criminals and felons at early ages, often before they're even old enough to vote, they're rendered permanently unemployable in the legal job market for the most part, virtually guaranteeing that most will cycle in and out of prison, sometimes for the rest of their lives. In this way, mass incarceration has decimated Black families to a degree comparable to slavery. Now, this isn't a phenomenon that affects just some small segment of the African American community. To the contrary, in many large urban areas today, more than half of working age African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In cities like Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, the statistics are far, far worse. It was reported several years ago that in Chicago, if you take into account prisoners, and if you actually count prisoners as people, because prisoners, of course, are excluded from poverty statistics and unemployment data, thus masking the severity of racial inequality in the United States. But if you actually count prisoners as people in the Chicago area, nearly 80% of working age African American men were reported to have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I find that when I tell people that, I now believe that mass incarceration is like a new Jim Crow, a new caste-like system, people typically react with this shocked disbelief. They say, well, how can you say that? How can you say that? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if Black folks would just stop running around committing so many crimes, we wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime and crime rates. It's just not true. Our prison population, our nation's prison population quintupled in a 30-year period of time. We went from a prison population of about 300,000 to now well over 2 million. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world. But this explosion in incarceration rates can't be explained simply by crime or crime rates. During that same 30-year period of time that incarceration rates quintupled, the crime rate fluctuated. Went up, went down, went back up again, went back down again, up, down. Now it's way down. As bad as crime rates are in many parts of the country today, crime rates are at historical lows. But incarceration rates, especially Black incarceration rates, have consistently soared. Most criminologists, sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially Black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime is going up or going down in any given community or the nation as a whole. So what explains the sudden explosion in incarceration, the birth of a penal system unprecedented in world history, if not crime and crime rates? Well, the answer is the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. Sheer punitiveness. Drug convictions alone, just drug convictions, accounted for about 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state prison system between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. To get a sense of how large a contribution the war on drugs has made to mass incarceration, say, consider this. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, the truth is most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. You don't have to raise your hand. Most do at some point in their lives, violate drug laws. But the enemy in this war has been racially defined. Not by accident, the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color. Even though studies have shown consistently now, decade after decade, that contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. And it's the last part that tends to trip people up, or sell. Turns out that drug markets, much like American society generally, are fairly segregated by race. Black folks typically sell to black folks. White folks typically sell to whites. Drug markets are even segregated by class. University students sell to each other. Drug dealing happens in all communities of all colors. But when we think of drug criminal, who do you see? A study was actually conducted on this question in the mid-1990s. A national survey was conducted asking people to close their eyes and imagine a drug criminal. More than 95% of respondents pictured someone who was African American. Less than 5% pictured someone of any other race or ethnicity. So when people think of drug criminal, they typically think of someone who's black or brown. But the data actually suggests that where significant differences can be found, frequently white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. I find that many people, when they actually see the data, the stark racial disparities, they say, oh, yeah, that's a shame. That's a shame, but we need to get tough on them. We need a drug war to deal with them in the hood, because that's where the violent offenders are. That's where the drug kingpins can be found. In fact, in my experience, most people seem to imagine that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities and the related violence. And for a long time, I believed that as well. But it's not the case. The current drug war was declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term, a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared his drug war, drug crime was on the decline, not on the rise, and less than 3% of the American population even identified drugs or drug crime as the nation's most pressing concern. So why declare a war, an all-out war, a drug war, at a time when drug crime is on the decline and the American public isn't that much concerned about it? Well, from the outset, the war on drugs had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction or drug abuse, and much to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who were anxious about and resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. I think, to be fair, we really do have to acknowledge that poor and working class whites, they really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. I mean, wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites, they were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids that might get bused across town to go to a school they believed was inferior. It was their kids and themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs against this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And then to make matters worse, a affirmative action programs created the perception that black folks were now leapfrogging over them on their way to Harvard or Yale or to fancy jobs in corporate America. And this state of affairs created an enormous amount of fear, resentment, anxiety, but it also created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. In the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he said, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. A few years after the drug war was declared, crack began to ravage inner city communities, and the Reagan administration seized on this development, with some glee actually hiring staff whose job it was to publicize inner city crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores, and crack-related violence, an effort to make crack a media sensation in the hopes that it would bolster public support for a drug war they had already declared and to persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, the media was saturated with images of black and brown drug dealers, the so-called crack babies, and a wave of punitiveness washed over the United States. Legislators began competing with each other to pass harsh mandatory minimums for minor drug offenses, sentences harsher than murderers receive in many other Western democracies. And soon Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war, far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. It was the Clinton administration that championed the laws banning drug offenders from federal financial aid for schooling upon release, banning drug offenders and people with criminal records from public housing, laws banning drug offenders even from food stamps under federal law. To a large extent, it was the Clinton administration, a Democratic administration, that is responsible for so many of the laws, policies, and practices that constitute the basic architecture of this new caste system. A Democrat, desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. And more than a few black politicians were among the voices calling for get tough. Now, those black politicians weren't only asking for more police and harsher sentences as the crack epidemic began to ravage inner city communities. Those politicians were asking also for more funding for schools and for job training programs. But as poor communities of color have learned time and time again, when you ask for good schools, you aren't likely to get them. When you ask for jobs or economic investment, you're not likely to get that either. The one thing that poor folks of color can ask for and get are police and prisons. And they wound up getting way more than they bargained for. Within the space of just a couple short decades, millions of people are now cycling in and out of our prison system, trapped in a vast new racial undercaste. Now, I find that many people who know this racial history will say, yeah, okay, that's a shame. That's unfortunate, but we still need to get tough on them, those in the hood. We still need a war on them because that is where the violent offenders can be found. That's where the drug kingpins can be found. Unfortunately, many folks just don't realize that this drug war has never been focused primarily on rooting out the violent offenders or the drug kingpins. Over the years, federal funding has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer numbers of drug arrests. It's become a numbers game in so many jurisdictions. Law enforcement agencies have been rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system for drug offenses through programs like the Edward Byrne Memorial Grant Program. Rewarded in cash for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system. And to make matters worse, federal drug forfeiture laws allow state and local law enforcement agencies to keep for their own use up to 80% of the cash, cars, homes seized from suspected drug offenders. You don't have to be convicted, just suspected of a drug offense. And law enforcement can take your cash off you, can take your car and sell it and keep the proceeds, thus giving law enforcement a direct monetary interest, not in ending drug addiction or drug abuse or even drug-related crime, but in the longevity of the war itself. And the results have been predictable. Overwhelming majority of people swept into the system have been arrested for relatively minor, nonviolent drug offenses. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or even significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, the Clinton years, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug that has now been shown to be less harmful, at least less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging this drug war almost exclusively in the hood, we've created this vast new racial undercast in an astonishingly short period of time. Now, where's the U.S. Supreme Court been in all of this? The supposed defender of discrete and insular minorities? Where has the U.S. Supreme Court been in all of this? Well, far from resisting the race to incarcerate or questioning the way in which the drug war has been waged, the U.S. Supreme Court has eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, granting to the police license to stop, frisk, search just about anyone, anywhere for drugs without a shred of evidence of criminal activity, no reasonable suspicion, no probable cause, as long as they get consent. Now, what's consent? Consent is when a police officer walks up to a young man on the street, and the officer has one hand on his gun, and he says to the kid, "Will you put your hands up in the air for a minute so I can frisk you, see what you got on you?" The kid says, "Uh-huh." That's consent. He's just waived his Fourth Amendment rights to unreasonable searches and seizures. He's consented to that encounter. The police do not have to have a shred of evidence, no reasonable suspicion now to frisk that young man. Now, I find that many people react to that state of affairs with a shrug of the shoulders saying, well, that may be inconvenient. That might even be humiliating, but I mean, that's not going to last long. And, if you just don't have anything on you, then you don't have much to worry about. Well, the problem is that these aren't isolated encounters. And that although people of all colors use and sell illegal drugs at about the same rates, if you only go fishing in some ponds, you're only going to catch fish there. The New York City Police Department reported that in 1 year alone, their officers stopped and frisked more than 600,000 people in 1 year alone. Overwhelming majority African American and Latino men. These stops, frisks, and searches add up hundreds of thousands of times, creating enormous racial disparities. which the U.S. Supreme Court has now ruled that we cannot even challenge in a court of law. In a series of cases beginning with McCleskey versus Kemp and Armstrong versus the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that it does not matter how overwhelming the statistical evidence might be. The court has ruled explicitly that it does not matter how severe the racial disparities are, unless you have proof of conscious, intentional bias, say an admission by a police officer or a law enforcement official of bias. You can't even state a claim for racial bias in the criminal justice system today. Now that poses quite a bit of a challenge to civil rights lawyers like myself, because after all, it's not common for a law enforcement official, police officer, to say to the judge, well, yes, Your Honor, the reason I stopped him was because he was black. No. Most police officers, like the rest of us, know better than to state our racial biases or stereotypes out loud. A prosecutor isn't going to say, well, you know, I would have given him a better plea deal. Or I might even dismiss the case and give him another shot if, but he's a black kid from, that neighborhood. And he is just up to no good. He is not going anywhere. I think he needs to be taught a lesson. When a more privileged white kid in a middle-class suburb might be viewed as worthy of a second or a third chance. Now, those unconscious biases and stereotypes play themselves out over and over and over again. And it's not that law enforcement officials are all necessarily out to get those black and brown boys in the hood. No. What's most important here is that so many of the biases and stereotypes that drive law enforcement decision-making operate on such an unconscious level that many well-meaning, well-intentioned law enforcement officials can't even admit to themselves their biases. A well-meaning police officer sees a group of young black kids walking down the street, their pants are sagging a little bit. The officer thinks, you know what, I'm going to jump out, frisk them, search them, see if they got anything on them. I'm doing my job. I'm keeping this neighborhood safe. That same officer, driving down the street in another neighborhood, see a group of young white kids walking down the street together. That would never enter his mind. Let me jump out, frisk them, have them lie spread eagle on the sidewalk. Now, that officer may not be meaning those black kids any harm. He's just thinking he's doing his job. But those unconscious biases and stereotypes play themselves out over and over again, hundreds of thousands of times in a single city, adding up to enormous racial disparities, which the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled we can't even challenge in a court of law. In fact, the racial profiling cases that I was bringing 10 years ago, so many of them we wouldn't even be able to file today. The U.S. Supreme Court has closed the courthouse doors to claims of racial bias at every stage of the criminal justice process, from stops and searches to plea bargaining and sentencing. In so many ways, the U.S. Supreme Court has effectively immunized this system of mass incarceration from judicial scrutiny for racial bias, much in the same way that it once rallied to the defense of slavery or Jim Crow in their day. But of course, being swept into this system with little hope of challenging the bias that may have got you there is just the beginning of your odyssey. Because once you've been swept in and branded a criminal or felon, you find that you're ushered into a parallel social universe in which the basic civil and human rights that apply to others no longer apply to you. For the rest of your life, you've got to check that box on employment applications, asking that dreaded question: have you ever been convicted of a felony? It doesn't matter if that felony happened a few weeks ago, a few years ago, or 35 years ago. For the rest of your life, you are checking that box, knowing full well your application's going straight to the trash. Many people will say, oh, come on, stop making excuses for people. People come out of prison, yeah, it's hard, but if you really apply yourself, you get out there, hustle, hit the pavement, put in your applications. It may take you a little while, but you can work if you really want to. I mean, you could get a job at McDonald's or something. I said, well, getting a job at McDonald's is no easy feat if you have a felony record. People say, well, they could start their own businesses. They could be entrepreneurs. I say, well, actually, most people coming out of prison don't have a whole lot of money to invest in a new business, but even if they did, hundreds of professional licenses are off limits to people convicted of felonies. In my state, in Ohio, can't even get a license to be a barber if you've been convicted of a felony. So you're released from prison, what are you expected to do? You can't get a job. You may be barred from housing, public housing projects, private landlords, free to discriminate against you and routinely do. Public benefits may be off limits to you. As I mentioned, thanks to President Clinton, under federal law, if you're convicted of a drug felony, you're deemed ineligible for food stamps for the rest of your life. Unfortunately, many states have now opted out of the federal ban on food stamps, but it remains the case that many people can't even get food stamps just because they were once caught with drugs. So what do we expect people released from prison to do? You're released from prison, can't get a job, you're barred from housing, even food stamps may be off limits to you. What do we expect folks to do? Well, apparently what we expect them to do is to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, which continues to accrue while you're in prison. And then in a growing number of states, you're actually expected to pay back the costs of your imprisonment. And paying back all these fees, fines, and court costs can be a condition of your probation or parole. And then if you're actually one of the lucky few, the very few who manages to get a job right out of prison, up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back all those fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support. When you step back and take a look at the system as a whole, not its discrete individual parts. If you take a look at the system as a whole, you're released from prison, what does the system seem designed to do? It seems to me designed to send folks right back to prison, which is what in fact happens the vast majority of the time. About 70% of people released from prison return within a few years. And the majority of those who return, some states do so in a matter of months, because the challenges associated with just mere survival on the outside are so immense. So what do we do? In the face of this? The emergence of this vast new system that has millions of people cycling in and out of our prison system. More than 65 million people in the United States now have criminal records. Have millions of people churning in and out of the system. Unable to work, unable to reunify with their families, support their children. What do we do in the face of this new caste-like system that has been born? Well, my own view is that nothing short of a major social movement has any hope of ending mass incarceration in America. Now, I know many people say, well, surely something less will do. Surely we don't need to build a movement to fix our criminal justice system. Surely we should be able to tinker with this machine and get it right, get it back on track, get it humming properly again. And if you're tempted to think that way, I would urge you to consider the sheer scale of this system. If we were to return to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, before the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement really kicked off, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison. 4 out of 5. More than 1 million people who are employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. Most new prison construction has occurred in predominantly white rural communities, communities that have been sold on prisons as an answer to their economic woes. And many times, these prisons are advertised as providing far more benefits than they actually deliver to these communities. But nonetheless, these communities now believe that their jobs, their livelihoods depend on prisons. Those prisons across America would have to close down. Private prison companies now listed on the New York Stock Exchange and doing quite well in a time of economic recession, they'd be forced to go bankrupt, belly up. This system is now so deeply rooted in our social, political, and economic structure, it's not going to just fade away. It's not going to just downsize out of sight without a major upheaval, a fairly radical shift in our public consciousness. Now, I know some people say, well, some downsizing is already occurring. We're on the right track. The fiscal crisis in states large and small have led some former Get Tough true believers like Newt Gingrich to say, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we need to downsize our prisons somewhat. And there have been reforms in some states. I believe we are going to see some prison downsizing in the years to come. But we need to think very carefully before we begin to imagine that the relatively modest prison downsizing that's likely to occur represents a great leap forward. We can reduce the size of our prison population quite dramatically simply by reducing the length of prison sentences. We could cut our nation's prison population in half simply by reducing by half the length of prison sentences. Instead of getting 10 years, you get 5. Instead of 14, you get 7. And you can cut the prison population in half just by doing that. But we will not have disturbed the caste system that exists as long as we still have millions of people churning in and out of our prison system, unable to find work, unable to find housing, unable to support themselves and their families. The length of time they spend in prison may be shorter. Instead of spending 10 years, they may spend 5, or instead of spending 3 years, they may be lucky and get just felony probation, but are still branded a felon for life, trapped in a permanent undercaste. Our goal can't be simply prison downsizing. It has to be dismantling this entire caste-like system that has kept millions trapped, locked up, and permanently locked out. Now, I know there's many people who will say to me, well, there's no hope of doing that. There's no hope of ending mass incarceration and dismantling this vast caste-like system that's been created. Just as many people will resign to the old Jim Crow in the South and would say, oh, that's a shame, but that's just the way that it is. I find that many people of all colors view the millions cycling in and out of our prison systems today as just an unfortunate but inalterable fact of American life. Well, I am certain that Dr. King and Ella Baker, Ann Braden, Sojourner Truth, and the many others who risked their lives to end earlier systems of racial and social control would not be so easily deterred. So I believe we have got to be willing to pick up where they left off and do the hard work of movement building on behalf of poor people of all colors. In 1968, Dr. King told advocates that the time had come to shift from a civil rights movement to a human rights movement. He said, meaningful equality cannot be achieved through civil rights alone. Without basic human rights, the right to work, the right to housing, the right to quality education, without basic human rights, he said, civil rights, they're an empty promise. So in honor of all those who labored to end the old Jim Crow, I hope we will commit ourselves to building a human rights movement to end mass incarceration, a movement for education, not incarceration, a movement for jobs, not jails, a movement to end all forms of legal discrimination against people released from prison, discrimination that denies them basic human rights to work, to shelter, to food. Now, what do we do to begin this movement, to build upon the work that's already being done? Well, first, I think we've got to admit the truth. We've got to be willing to tell the truth. We've got to be willing to admit out loud that we as a nation have managed to recreate a caste-like system in this country. We've got to be willing to tell these truths in our churches, in our places of worship, in our schools, in prisons, in reentry centers. We've got to be willing to tell these truths so that a great awakening can begin. Because unlike the old Jim Crow, There are no signs alerting you to the existence of this new caste system. The whites-only signs are gone. In prisons, they are out of sight, out of mind. And the people who cycle in and out of these prisons, for the most part, typically live in segregated or impoverished communities, out of sight of mainstream America, people who zoom around on freeways past the virtual and literal prisons in which people live. Out of sight, out of mind. It is easy to live your whole life and have no idea of what is going on. So if we are going to build a movement, if we are going to be serious about undoing the harm that has been done, we have got to make it visible. We have got to be willing to pull back the curtain and reveal what has been hidden in plain sight. But of course, just a lot of consciousness raising isn't going to be enough. It's necessary, it's essential, but it's not going to be enough. We've also got to be willing to get to work. And in my view, that means building an underground railroad for people returning home from prison. An underground railroad supporting people as they try to make a genuine break for real freedom, providing people with help finding employment, housing, food, help getting education. We've got to open our doors, open the doors of our churches, of our schools, of our places of employment, and welcome people returning home from prison, and supporting the families of those who have loved ones behind bars. We've got to create safe places for people so they feel welcomed and loved as they try to survive in this era of mass incarceration. Creating safe places where people actually have a shot at survival. But of course, even that isn't going to be enough, because just as in the days of slavery, it wasn't enough to shuttle a few to freedom one by one, feeding and housing a few one by one. You had to be willing to work for abolition. Well, today I believe we have got to be willing to work for the abolition of this system of mass incarceration as a whole. And that means ending the war on drugs once and for all. Ending it. We've spent, yes. We have spent $1 trillion waging the drug war since it began. $1 trillion. Funds that could have been spent on education or job creation in the communities that needed it most, on drug treatment. Instead, we use those dollars to pave the way for the destruction of countless lives, families, and dreams. It is time to shift to a public health model for dealing with drug addiction and drug abuse, and stop criminalizing people who may be struggling with what amounts to real public health problems and crises. And we've also got to end all these forms of legal discrimination against people, discrimination that denies people basic human rights to work, to shelter, and to food. And last but not least, we have got to shift from a purely punitive approach to dealing with violence and violent crime in our communities to a more restorative and rehabilitative approach, one that takes seriously the interests of the victim, the offender, and the community as a whole. So we have got a lot of work to do. And if it feels like too much, it seems like it can't possibly be done, I hope we keep in mind that all of these rules, laws, policies, and practices rest upon one core belief. And it is the same core belief that sustained Jim Crow. It is the belief that some of us are not worthy of genuine care, compassion, or concern. And when we effectively challenge that core belief, this whole system begins to crumble, begins to fall like dominoes. A multiracial, multi-ethnic human rights movement must be born, one that takes seriously the dignity and humanity of all people. And it's got to be multiracial and multi-ethnic, because although this drug war may have been born with black folks in mind, it is a war that has destroyed the lives of people and communities of all colors. And the same divisive, get-tough racial politics that helped to birth the drug war are now leading to another prison-building boom, this one aimed at suspected illegal immigrants. So we have got to connect the dots. and build a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement on behalf of all of us. But again, before this movement can truly get underway, a great awakening is required. We have got to awaken from this colorblind slumber that we've been in to the realities of race in America. And we have got to be willing to embrace those deemed criminals. Not necessarily all their behavior, but them, their humanness. For it has been the refusal and failure to recognize the dignity and humanity of all people that has been the sturdy foundation for every caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else in the world. It's our task, I firmly believe, to end not just mass incarceration, not just the war on drugs, but to end this history and cycle of caste in America. Thank you so much for having me tonight, and I welcome your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to answer a few questions. I'm told we don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to take a few. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like for you to address the issue of how the prison population is used to be counted for political office, and also the whole deal about the telephone business.
Yes, excellent. Yes, well, over the years, the U.S. Census has counted prisoners where they are incarcerated for the purposes of the census, rather than counted them as members of their home communities. And the effect of this is that those counties, which again, as I mentioned, are typically predominantly white rural counties where prisons are located, have their populations inflated by the prisoners that are now counted there, and therefore they get increased representation in the state legislature, those counties do, while the communities from which the prisoners came lose representation and political power. On top of that, some state as well as federal funding is distributed based on the census count. And so those very communities, the impoverished communities from which prisoners often come, lose funding for desperately needed services, while the counties where they are held receive additional funding for services that the incarcerated population are most certainly not likely to receive. And of course, the incarcerated population is not allowed to vote for the representatives, the additional representatives that those counties are afforded. So in this way, those census rules have distorted the political map and afforded, greater political power to those counties and communities that, warehouse and incarcerate the largest numbers of people. Oh, and the telephone company. This is, a lot of people have asked me about, the profit that now exists in incarceration. And when people talk about the money that's made off of incarceration, people are typically thinking about these now very large private prison companies that are literally profiting from the caging of human beings. But there's a whole range of other private interests that profit from mass incarceration, not the least of which are phone companies, which have gouged prisoners and their families, charging exorbitant rates for people to remain in touch with their loved ones behind bars. And these exorbitant fees are particularly devastating for children who often cannot travel long distances to see their parents behind bars, but have families that cannot possibly afford the hundreds of dollars per month phone bills that would be necessary in order to stay in regular contact with their loved ones behind bars. And so the ways in which phone companies have gouged prisoners and their families, I think, is one of many examples of how private interests have come to profit from mass incarceration. And there's a great book on the subject of profiting from incarceration called Prison Profiteers: Who Makes Money Off of Mass Incarceration. And it describes the wide range of companies, businesses who profit from mass incarceration, including taser gun manufacturers, private health care providers that provide typically abysmal health care behind prison walls, but get these incredibly lucrative contracts. Many corporations that have moved their jobs behind bars rather than shipping them overseas because they can actually work those folks for less than they could work them in China. So I highly recommend that book for those who are interested in learning more about who profits from mass incarceration. Thank you.
Well, I really have two questions for you, but one of them I should ask you, subsequent to the lecture when you're signing books. And the other is the question that I asked, my fellow students when I was a student here, or a variation on it. If all of your activism for the rest of your life was going to add up to one amendment to the U.S. Constitution, obviously one will not be enough. But if you could get only one passed, what would it say?
Well, that's a little tough one to answer on the spot. Being a lawyer, language matters a lot, so I'd want to spend a long time crafting it. But, I think that I would love to see basic human rights written into the text of our U.S. Constitution.
You mean specifically Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, social, economic, and cultural rights, right?
I would like to see, yes, a version of the basic rights that are articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, incorporated into our Constitution, as it has been in South Africa. What's interesting is you take a look at the path South Africa has followed since partially dismantling apartheid, is that they were determined not to follow in the U.S. Model by articulating only civil rights in their constitution, but incorporated human rights as part of their founding document. And I think that's essential. Now, South Africa has a long, long way to go to realizing the human rights for all that are articulated in their constitution. But at least they've made the commitment to try to deliver on those rights. And so the question is whether they will actually deliver on the rights that exist in their constitution or not. We don't even have basic human rights in our constitution as acknowledged. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that there is no fundamental right to education in the United States. And so I think if I were to come up with one amendment, it would be one that would try to ensure that basic human rights to quality education, to work, to shelter, to food, to safety and security were acknowledged as important as freedom of speech.
So first of all, thank you so much for your remarks. This is a really exciting moment for me to have you here in Tulsa. So thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Also, as an organizer, it's hard for me to see a room of people who can make social change and see a microphone and not use it. So you will all, have to indulge me for a moment while I mention that there is a bill currently being proposed in the Oklahoma legislature. Please, if you have phones or pens or other implements by which to take notes, I invite you to take those out now. HB 2014, co-sponsored by our very own Gary Stanislawski from here in Tulsa, would eliminate SNAP benefits to felons in Oklahoma. This would mean that up until now we have allowed food stamps to felons, and if this law were to pass, we would no longer do so. So I invite you to call, tweet, text, email, or storm the Capitol and let Senator Stanislawski know that you are not in support of HB 2014.
Excellent.
Secondly, I'm so grateful that you brought up immigration, and I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about the intersection there. Or option B, depending on which one is more inspiring to you, being as how we are in a city whose public school system, as well as many others in Oklahoma, have their own police force. I wanted you to maybe talk about the school-to-prison pipeline and how that contributes to the wave of mass incarceration.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm so glad you gave people an opportunity to take action immediately in a way that will make a difference for folks who are struggling to survive after being released. I think actually the intersection between kind of immigration and mass incarceration is critically important, and I would love to see those who are working for immigration reform and are championing immigration rights and those who are working for criminal justice reform to see themselves marrying their work in the long run. And unfortunately, that's been a bit of a challenge, in part because I think so many of the folks who have been championing immigrant rights have been committed to distancing themselves from criminals and saying, we're here just trying to work, we're not criminals. And that's understandable. I mean, in the United States, the last folks you want to be compared to are criminals. So it makes perfect sense that people who are struggling for survival, trying to come in, do right by their families, would say, I'm not with them, that crowd. I am not a criminal. The problem, of course, is that if we are ever going to acknowledge the basic human rights for all, we're going to have to acknowledge that you are entitled to basic human rights, basic human dignity, whether you cross the border illegally or not, whether you're once caught with drugs or not, that what entitles you to basic dignity and respect and our moral concern is not whether you've ever violated the law, but because you are a human being deserving of our dignity and respect. And I think it's that understanding that I think has to undergird both movements if they're going to be, fully successful in the long run. And as for education, I think you're absolutely right. With the police and the schools and all of that, all you're doing is ensuring that kids are on the fast track from schools to prisons, the kinds of, infractions that once got a trip to the principal's office or a phone call home now are worthy of arrest. And, I really recommend the work of the Advancement Project as well as the Children's Defense Fund for those who are really interested in kind of tackling, the school-to-prison pipeline and those issues. There are a lot of resources provided by both of those organizations to delve into that work. Yes.
Thank you for speaking to us. It seems from the perspective of an employer that there's a greater liability associated with hiring a felon. Even if there's no greater chance of them doing something wrong at work, even if it's a nonviolent offense, the fact that somebody's going to say, I told you so, or you should have known better, if something goes wrong, seems to be a significant impediment to hiring felons. Are there ways of addressing that, laws that may be enacted? Or?
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, the EEOC has been taking steps in the right direction. In fact, the EEOC issued guidelines basically telling employers that they could not legally and consistent with Title VII have a blanket prohibition on hiring people with felony records or with criminal records. And interestingly, the theory underlying the EEOC's prohibition on, a blanket denial policy is that having that kind of policy violates Title VII because it has such a disparate impact on racial and ethnic minorities. And so really what's unspoken here is that because this system of mass incarceration and the war on drugs has had such a grossly disproportionate impact on people of color, you are effectively engaging in employment discrimination if you refuse to hire felons as a category. Nonetheless, employers routinely do, and as I cite in my book, all of these examples of where people advertise no felons, no criminal records, no misdemeanors, nothing, and so it's still accepted as common practice for employers to do that sort of thing. But what's more is what you point out, which is that even if employers claim that they don't have a blanket policy of hiring people with criminal records, they're deterred because they're afraid that if they do and then something bad happens, they could be exposing themselves to liability. I think that we ought to provide explicit legal protections for employers who hire people who have criminal records and create actual financial incentives for employers to do so. I just don't see any way for us to undo the harm that's been done if we don't actually affirmatively encourage employers to welcome people who've been released from prison back home. And, if we treat criminal records in many ways as sort of a protected class and category, with the understanding that, in our legal system, once you've done your time, you should be given a fair shot at getting another job, et cetera, that, we should have, there should be an affirmative duty not to discriminate against those categories of folks. And I hope that the EOC will move further in that direction, although until public sentiment changes and until this movement really gets going, it'll be difficult for the EOC to go beyond where they are today. Thank you so much again for having me.